Right, so we are diving into week 3 in this wonderful, wonderful book. And I want to say thank you again to Charter Oak for their gracious hosting. I did volunteer to do this, which might make me, I don't know, a little hungry for it. So I don't know. Um, so let's just review a little bit about where we've been. Week 1, we did the introduction to Riane and her work, the history of her work, the genesis of her work, and also a bit about me and what got me into this. We covered the domination partnership social scale, looking at the qualities of what these systems all have in common across cultures, across history, what the domination system has in common, and what the partnership model actually can be seen to provide a human society when it's the dominant attracting force for social organization. We did our little group introductions. I got to know you guys a little bit. We looked at the 4 cornerstones, Riane's distillation of what areas of society can most effectively the shift toward partnership that we want to see. As she often mentions, we're at a state of technological development where we are in a severe domination regression at the moment, but as she has often said, one more regression could be our last. We have that level of technology, and domination systems, it's worth mentioning, are inherently self-destructive. They destroy themselves after a certain amount of time, and I think that cycle gets quicker and quicker the more technology we have to create pain and chaos. So, and then also the homework assignment was the 90-second pleasure meditation, also called Taking in the Good. Many of us were not able or aware to do that, so we ended up doing that in week 2 together, which was a lot of fun for me. Last week, we talked about nonlinearity and unpredictability as kind of part of what we were experimenting with in that session. We did the experiential exploration of simple pleasure. We did a long form group discussion on that. And we also kind of, I put out a grab bag of concepts to check where people's interests were. And we had a really fun discussion. So I got a lot of comments in the chat and I got questions from you guys, and we riffed on that, which was really fun. And again, there is this invitation for you to do your reflections. I love journaling as a way to deepen my thought process about things. Stream of consciousness writing really does have a kind of trance-inducing effect in a good way for me. So if that is something that also affects you positively, I highly encourage it, as this work can really go deeper and deeper. And the focus of my practice going forward is really helping people, individuals and groups, recognize internalized domination patterns that might still seem like virtues, and or might just still seem like the way things are or the way things ought to be, and piecing that out and then providing more partnership oriented, kinder, gentler alternatives. So I hinted last week that we'd be talking more about the sacred this week, and I'm sorry, I'm having the overlap of Zoom with PowerPoint is creating a situation where I can't quite see my own notes. So 1 second. All right, so this is actually what we missed doing last week because I did run out of time. I was going to suggest these questions for your own passive or active reflection, because we are going to be talking about the sacred images, and institutionalized religion's use of domination systems in our politics, to help maintain domination systems and structures of power that help keep people at the top stay at the top. So we're going to be doing this together instead, but I just want to plant the seed now for you to start thinking about it, thinking about your relationship with the sacred. What does that word mean to you? Feel free to pop things into the chat as well. through your lifespan. I'm also interested in, well, in my dissertation study, a number of my participants talked about their religious upbringing and how it influenced their sexuality, mostly for ill, I will say, unfortunately, but that doesn't necessarily define our relationship to the sacred, right? Religion and a sacred relationship to life and the processes of life are not necessarily equivalent forces. So I am wondering what your relationship is with holy language, meaning loaded words like God, soul, spirit, sin, redemption, prayer, blessing, grace. Obviously, these have a very much a Western ring to it, which is funny because I grew up in a Hindu-based spiritual community, but it is probably the more accessible range of language. However, if you come from a different background, please also feel free to pop words in the chat or let us know other words that feel relevant here. So obviously words like yoga, mantra, meditation are all more in our current lexicon because of the spiritual revolution and the consciousness revolution from several decades ago, of which I think I'm sort of a product. And I'm getting one comment in the chat saying, I'm not keen on them. I attempt to find less triggering words. Right. So ambivalence, yes. So we're already in a theme of dislike and preferring to find more neutral or less loaded language to describe the same thing. Also wondering if you have a prayer or a meditation practice and how is that going? Is it something you feel like you should be doing more of? Is it something you feel is a duty? Is it something you think of as part of your self-care, mental health routine? Has it become more of an obligation, or is it something that feels like a gift to yourself? That sort of question is going to be important for the reflections going forward. And is your spirituality more conceptual or is it more embodied? And just a suggestion of a little journal exercise, describe a moment of transcendence or transformation in your life. And how does that connect to your spirituality? Or some other word that you'd like to use for the opportunity of transcendent states of consciousness and what they mean to you. I want to have a meditation practice, but have not made time or space for it. And that's a comment in the chat. I hear that a lot. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that there's a feeling that it would give us benefits. It would be a good thing to do. And there's this feeling that we don't have enough time and that giving time to that is something that's a struggle. I completely hear that. I also have a comment that says, I have a good meditation practice. I try to engage in it throughout the day. That's beautiful and wonderful, and that sounds delicious. And we have a question from Donna. Do you think people's negative reaction to these terms is, at least in part, a result of the domination model they often represent? Oh, Donna, 3 slides ahead, as usual. Absolutely. The answer to that question is yes. The answer to that question is yes. I really do believe that there has been a process over the last 50, 60 years of people distancing themselves from their religious origins in terms of their family of origin. There's a lot of people who just no longer identify as affiliated with any religion. The number of people 30 years old and under that do not actually feel affiliated with any form of institutionalized religion is growing and growing and growing. They're called the non-affiliated, or sometimes the nons. And I absolutely believe that that is a result of a partnership thrust, as Riane would say, away from these dominator models that, instead of actually opening our consciousness to transcendence and liberation, fragment and dull and numb our consciousness and instill a sense of fear and a need to be obedient to the teachings that were handed down generation to generation to support and maintain this dominator model. No question. I absolutely believe that's true. Yes, and I have another comment in the chat. Having come from a very judgmental upbringing, my daily practice is extending kindness to myself. That is wonderful. So yes, one of the aspects of a sort of restorative spirituality is asking ourselves, how did my upbringing instill domination patterns, and what kind of practices are going to help me heal from that? And that itself is something I would define as a spiritual practice. Whether you're atheistic, agnostic, or just prefer not to think in those terms, whether divinity as a concept is at all part of that, I do think of that as a spiritual practice. Or we could even go back to the etymology of the word religious, which comes from re, to do again, and ligamente, to connect. So the word essentially boils down to forms of reconnection. And of course, ligament also brings us back to the body. And then I had another one that I missed, which is a question: is drinking drinking tea meditation? It's a comment, I'm sorry. Walking meditation, eating meditation, absolutely. So now we're getting into this wider trend of mindfulness practice, which I also have to say is a really wonderful trend in psychology and therapy over the last 20 years. Mindfulness as a way to help support mental health has been a big move. And so now these practices that were considered religious are becoming well, unfortunately, in some ways they're becoming medicalized, but in other ways they're becoming more accessible to people without all of the dogma attached, which I think is very positive overall. And yes, and my body participates and facilitates my spiritual experience, and extending the absence of judgment to those around me. So again, deepening that practice of kindness to myself as a sort of restorative spiritual practice to help recover from ways that our upbringing might have been domination oriented and otherwise traumatizing. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Did I skip something? No. Okay. Great. So in the spirit of getting back to the text a little bit, I got to tell you, Nurturing Our Humanity was a lot easier to pull selections from. This book has more of a conversational style. It weaves and jumps and dances, and it is an incredible piece of work, but it's very difficult to find distilling paragraphs and pages. So instead, I went straight to the back and looked at a chart, which are, Riane is very good at summarizing in charts. And so thank goodness for that. But so on pages 404 and 405 in Sacred Pleasure, we have a chart that basically boils it down in terms of these sort of categories of our life and how they are differently represented and enacted in a domination and partnership model. And I'd like to get some other voices in the room. I do prefer it. So I'm going to pick on Donna first and ask you to read the Dominator model window there for her definition of spirituality across these two different forms of social structure.
Man and spirituality are ranked over women and nature, justifying their domination and exploitation. The powers that govern the universe are imaged as punitive entities, be it as a detached father whose orders must be obeyed on pain of terrible punishments, a cruel mother, or demons and monsters who delight in arbitrarily tormenting humans and hence must be placated.
And I also added my own little thought at the end there that the image of God in this kind of model is more that there is a creator and we are creations, and bridging that gap is essentially heretical. Now, of course, that's not always the case. In certain Eastern traditions, you do have the idea of the God stuff being a unity, but there are other systems within those practices that then can create domination or maintain domination systems. For instance, the caste system is maintained by an idea that your karma put you where you are in life. So if you're poor, or if you're an untouchable, et cetera, it's because you did something really, really bad in a life you just don't remember. So, suck it up and try to do better this time. And then maybe you'll climb the ladder. right? So even in spiritual traditions that have more of a sense that we and our creator are not separate, there are still going to be teachings that help justify systems of pain and economic exploitation. And can I get another volunteer to read the partnership window? I can wait.
Shawnee had her hand up.
Oh,
Okay.
like I said, I literally cannot see
sorry.
hands. So
And I have trouble working my left hand. So anyway,
Okay.
the partnership model, the spiritual dimension of both women's and nature's life-giving and sustaining powers is recognized and highly valued, as are these powers in men. Spirituality is linked with empathy and equity, and the divine is imagined through myths and symbols of unconditional love. Women also feature as ordained, but not above. And we're checking out your Minoan fresco in your next slide.
Yes. So you get to, so I'm going to show you one of Riane's favorite images. There's also on YouTube, there's a video of an interview she gave, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, right when this work was sort of exploding on the scene. And it's about ancient art and what it can tell us about how we used to do things, and the hints at an earlier and much longer partnership oriented history in our prehistory. And we get a lot of that from art and artifacts from that time. And then also, as opposed to the sort of separate above below creator created consciousness, it's about unity with the divine force, right? So that we are part of the whole. Our actions affect the whole, not just in the form of offering placating blood sacrifices and whatnot else to help stave off any punishments, but rather that through good stewardship and through good practice, we can maintain harmony with our natural surroundings. And that is actually what helps us avoid famine and plague. So let's take a look at this fresco. It is one of her favorites. I apologize for not getting a higher resolution image. In case you can't see, this is a priestess in the middle of a ritual. She is bare-chested. She is holding her hands out in a sort of classical gesture of receptivity. I mean, in a certain way, she is forming a chalice with her hands, right? She is forming the cup for receiving the divine energy and opening to the grace of the gods. And in this fresco also, Riane always points out that there is no hierarchy level, which artistically is in artistic representations of sacred imagery later on, that is rare. Above and below is used to indicate a higher spiritual attainment, but in this image we see that they're all on the same level and they're all participating in this ritual. I'd like to invite verbal or written commentary also about if you've seen this image before, if there's anything else that strikes you.
I don't know about equity, but it seems that, maybe they're male, maybe they're not, but they don't have much clothes on. So in my mind, that sort of makes them vulnerable. I don't know what the little banner is going across the middle, the smoky part, but she's more clothed than they are. So I don't know if that implies that maybe she does have some power over them.
Well, power is certainly present in her. Her presence emanates power, no doubt. But it's also interesting that you said power over them. And I think what this image says, especially again, them being on the level and them all participating in this ritual, is that her role, I mean, so again, we're talking about the difference of a hierarchy of domination and a hierarchy of actualization and co-creation. In this image, she has a different role than everybody else. Equity is not about equality. If you see what I mean, that equality doesn't mean a flat society. We're not talking about creating a society in which there are no leaders or there are no specialties. She is the priestess and she is the leader in this ritual. And at the same time, everybody else is on the same level as her and gesturing toward her, bringing what looks like maybe some sort of oil or liquid to, or water to her. And she is there in the place of divine receptivity. So yes, absolutely, I agree that she has power, but whether or not she is enacting power over these people would be a good question. And I see in the chat, no weapons are visible. Absolutely correct. There are no weapons in this image. And so again, we're in the process of a sacred rite. And there is no presence of weaponry. And Minoan Crete, I believe, if I'm correct on this, it's one of the civilizations that had, I think, thousands and thousands of years of history. But I think Riane said something like 1,000 years of history and development and no indications in the archaeological record of warfare. So no armaments, no large weapons, no walls around the civilization. So I also see, some wonderful comments here. The men's hands are held in an interesting position. Yes, again, there's this openness, right? I don't know, let's try this. Let's take on everybody who feels comfortable with this. Let's just go ahead, close your eyes if you want to. Let's try this gesture first. Just close your eyes, open your hands, create that chalice with your arms, and breathe into it for a few seconds. Wonderful. Did anybody notice any changes when you did that?
I think my blood pressure actually went down.
Yeah, and it only took a few seconds, right? It's kind of amazing. And Gia says there was an increase in receptivity. Yes, and I do really think that's what that gesture is about, openness to the divine. And one of the things that we're going to be exploring later is the reality that openness to the divine is also an invitation to chaos, and that's and the ordering of that chaos toward nurturing growth and sustainability is how partnership-oriented spirituality is essentially different. More openness and receptivity, receiving. My back went straight and settled into myself. Felt gently powerful. Wonderful. And now let's imitate the men. I mean, I think they're men. Let's try that. Go ahead and close your eyes and notice that their wrists are bent a little bit, their fingers are up a little bit, and there is this sort of gesture of honoring, I would say, in a way. But I want you to also open up to your own experience and see what it feels like to you. Beautiful. What did you notice? What did that feel like as a gesture? Oh, interesting. We have a comment that it said a little bit like I was protecting myself. I did not expect that. Felt honoring and connecting. Anyone else?
It felt like an openness to receiving whatever is here in the present moment.
Absolutely. More horizontal energy. Absolutely. And that's fascinating because I don't even know what it means, but I believe you're right. Gia says, they seem to be receiving from her as she received from above. That is a gesture that can be used to give energy or support, honoring and connecting. It takes a lot of energy to stretch. Yes. And for our wonderful participant who is healing her wrist, maybe this will help. Maybe we can actually, I think we could do a little bit of an experiment and open up to just offering. And what is your name, darling? With the wrist brace?
Shawnee.
Shawnee, hi. All right, well, let's just do a little experiment. I'm going to invite Donna to play the priestess role. Get your hands up there. And all of us, for just a few seconds, are going to support her. And we're all going to give whatever energy comes through, as long as it's a blessing, to Shawnee and see how it feels just for a few seconds. All right, Donna, you first. What did you feel?
I felt a welcoming to both humans and the divine, to the humans present, and kind of like the fact that my body then became a vessel also for the divine.
Absolutely. I personally felt, I also, I saw a comment here, the role of supporting. That was a very strong energy for me, that I felt that something was happening and I was supporting and protecting it. Almost like, for me, actually, the first thing that comes to mind doing this gesture is a spotter in a gymnastics class. That's the first thing I think of when I do this with my hands. Like, I'm here in case you need me. Anyone else? What did they feel doing that? And we have a comment that says, I loved having a place to send healing energy. I felt like I was supporting energy. A way of saying, I come in peace, no weapons. Yes. I felt an energy increase, fueled and focused on Shawnee's wrist. I felt like I was giving my energy to someone. Beautiful. So you see how simple it is and how it takes only a few seconds. And we can call it prayer, we can call it magic, we can call it whatever we want. But we're experiencing something together. And these gestures are indicative really of what the religious ritual was that these people were practicing. And all it takes is a little moment of embodying it to sort of go there as a group. Shawnee, how about you? What was your experience?
Well, this is the most I've been able to move my thumb all week. So somebody's got some powerful energy coming through. And I can finally make a fist, kind of. So we're getting there.
Wow.
I've been
Okay.
chanting, something from one of my teachers, like, Ram Ramaya Swaha, which is about healing pain and just healing in general. So
That is wonderful. Well, and if and when and anytime anyone wants to over the next week, you can come back into that prayerful space. And I believe, Shawnee, if you would like to receive it, I'm sure several of us would be happy to offer you that energy from afar sometimes. How does that sound?
I'm open to many things. When I tap, I go, I'm open to higher inspiration. So send it on.
All right. So if anybody wants to connect with that feeling, like you're sending your positive energy somewhere, you have a willing receiver right here. Linda asks, is this related to the origin of Reiki? I am not a scholar of Reiki, but I have no doubt in my mind that the power of focused energetic presence has deep, deep origins as far back as we go, really. And so there's going to be a common ancestor there somewhere. But I honestly am not a student of the history of Reiki, so I cannot speak on that in a scholarly way. And yes, and Rachel says you also see gestures like this in some Christian churches during gospel music. That was the other thing. First for me, it was the gymnastics. And then the other thing is when your hands are a little bit higher, especially during the music, right? Sometimes one hand, sometimes two. But yes, we see that a lot. And there is this energy of both receiving and supporting what is happening in the sermon and in the ritual. Okay, wonderful. So I hope this gives you a sense of what we mean when we talk about hints and clues in the art of our ancient civilizations, that there really was a different way of being. All right, and I'd like another volunteer to read the Dominator model blurb on sexuality from page 404.
Just ask something real quick about the last one.
Absolutely.
A couple people, there was like a lot of comments coming in the chat, but there was a couple that were bringing up the difference in skin color.
Mhm.
I found that curious and just wondered if
Yeah, no,
there's any
that's
comments
and
on
that's a question that I feel like, again, I'm not equipped to speak on in a knowledgeable way. I could guess, but I'm interested in that too. I think that's a very interesting comment. I'm sorry I skipped over it. I got into the gestures, but if I find out anything, I will bring that back and let you know. One thing I do know is that you know, the lighter skin tones, you know, even before Aryan invasions and various things, lighter skin tones have often been used to depict difference, right? So the priestess is going to be indoors doing her rituals, and these men are likely going to be outside in the sun. So there's kind of a natural explanation for why they might be a slightly different tone. And then there's also probably an exaggeration of that to create more of a holy effect, would be one of my guesses. The white looked like makeup. Could be. So I will make a note of that. I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm going to try to find out for you guys. So who wants to read this next one?
I
I'll
could
read
do
it.
the Dominator model.
Please do.
Coercion is a major element in mate selection, sexual intercourse, and procreation. With the eroticization of dominance and or the repression of erotic pleasure through fear. Primary functions of sex are male procreation and male sexual release.
Mm-hmm. Who would like to read the partnership model for sexuality?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
So partnership model, mutual respect and freedom of choice for both females and males are characteristic of mate selection, sexual intercourse, and procreation. Primary functions of sex are the bonding between female and male through the give and take of mutual pleasure and the reproduction of the species.
Great. And of course, that connects back to the discussion of the sacred, right? This all connects. And of course, you start to see the pattern more as you look for it in different places. So we're talking about a completely different image of sexuality and what it's for and who it's for. Donna, did I see your hand go up? You're one of the only people I can see.
Yes. So this book was written a long time ago. Obviously, this is a heterosexist analysis of the partnership model. I'm sure that Riane would. I guess it's a question. Would Riane write it differently now?
Yeah, no, and actually, I was going to bring that up next. So again, you're on the same slide this time, but thank you. You're the best plant I never paid, so thank you for that, Donna. Yeah, so Riane, of course, is writing in the mid-90s. This was radical at the time. We had not exploded in our consciousness in terms of the gender spectrum. And I am completely certain that she would write with sensitivity to gender diversity now. That and not to mention sexual diversity, right? So in a partnership model, I like to believe that queer sex is also very much supported, and the use of queer sex for bonding and pleasure is completely supported. That is absolutely part of it too. So also,
I'm sorry.
No,
it also
please.
just goes to show how insidious the Dominator model is. Like it's snuck into the partnership model.
Oh, and it does, and it will. And so again, as a child of the sort of spiritual revolution of the 70s, of course, I was born in the 80s, but my parents met in the 70s. I am a product of an experiment in discarding religion and trying a new thing. But I can promise you that the partnership model snuck back into that, or the dominator model snuck back into that too. And so that's actually something that we're going to be looking at, and I hope will be fruit for discussion, is looking at the ways in which even our new spiritualities and our attempts at revolution in consciousness really do keep regrowing these dominator weeds. And I think now with her, the progress of her work into neuroscience and how that affects people through the lifespan, we can really see that unless we really attack it at the root, in terms of raising children differently and creating different versions of family, this thing will keep growing back and finding ways back into things that are otherwise supposed to nurture and care for us. Any other comments on this slide before we move on? All right. Okay, so a little more art. So we're talking about images not only of the sacred and the divine, but of sexuality. And of course, in many cases, there's a lot of overlap, right? This one happens to come more from a Western representation of the Greek tradition. And it's a little bit convenient to blame the Greeks for being the creators of these very rapey and abusive god figures, and to blame that on paganism. As I was looking for these images, I saw a lot of conservative Christian articles essentially suggesting that the pagan gods were evil and lascivious in this way. But this is a rendition of the rape of Proserpina, or Persephone. So then we can, of course, assume that that is Pluto, or Hades, the god of the underworld, taking her away. Doesn't matter what the ladies think. And so, you know, this is actually their origin myth for the birth of the seasons, for seasonality, that the god of the underworld came and took Persephone, the daughter of Mother Earth, essentially the Earth Mother goddess. Her daughter was taken away and brought to the underworld and essentially kidnapped. And that her mother's grief at her loss was so intense that the world had its first winter. And Persephone was eventually able to get out, but not after eating a few pomegranate seeds, which meant that she had to spend 6 months a year in the underworld. And so we get this cycle of death and regeneration that we see in the northern and southern hemispheric zones, not so much in the equatorial zones. Joseph Campbell has some really interesting analysis on how the equatorial zones have different mythology, less death and rebirth, possibly because they don't have the same experience of seasonality. So there's a connection there. But what do we notice about this image? This is also another sacred image, and it is also a sexual image. Yes, thank you. The Earth Mother is Demeter. Thank you. I also have to say, like, this is a Western painter in the 1600s. So we also notice that the evil figure is darker. So we're talking about skin color and noticing skin color in paintings. That's something we can also notice here, is that the villain has browner skin. I don't necessarily think that Hades is going to naturally be darker toned, but that is part of how Rubens decided to portray this. Also, I'm just going to notice he was certainly famous for his full-bodied female figures, and as much as I don't appreciate this image in certain ways, that's nice. That's nice to see. Okay, well, we can move on. But this is kind of what we're talking about. And I'm certainly not an art historian. That is not my area of expertise. But looking at these images, I think, can help us really spot sacred imagery and pick it apart a little bit, and try to understand a little bit of the story, not only the story it's telling, but the story it's assuming is true, which are two different things, right? But a lot of these artistic images, I think it's actually a team of horses. I believe he's in a chariot, so it's probably 2 horses. But yes.
If I could just say something that just matches up with some. I've just finished attending a course on Plato's Dialogues, which is Socrates. And this is exactly, so maybe he's darker because what they say at that time is when you are in prey of all these earthly and material passions, like eros for the materiality, it was a bronze emotion. It was you're a bronze person.
That would
and
make
you're
a
doing
lot of
bronze
sense.
things.
Doing bronze.
And this, and because it was a god, this is what Socrates and Plato's project was to rise above, take these ideals of creativity and render them into a silver, and even right to golden. But I noticed with the cupids there, this is also condoned because they are there with their arrows and everything.
Yes, absolutely. So there is, even though there's a battle going on here. There's definitely resistance, and there's also support. So you can see that on some level, divinity is supporting this, which is really interesting.
But I would like to say that there was the philosophers, at least, did not condone this. The sophists condoned this because that was the status quo.
Right.
So we also have, unfortunately, the Greeks being, these were the bridge between, and they did not condone this kind of violence at all, actually. But
right. Right. And so yeah, and there is that delineation made between what is our, as you mentioned, our higher nature and then our animal nature, right? And this tradition of thought goes way back, that there are certain passions that are low and certain pleasures that are high, right? That the intellectual pursuit and the philosophical pursuit is the purest form of life, et cetera, et cetera. So this definitely also paints that picture of a sense that lust and passion are of a lower order.
I'm wondering about the significance of sort of the red cloth. When I think of the red tent and the rape of Diana, the hemorrhaging woman, some of those other images regarding red and blood and all of that.
I think you're absolutely onto something, in the sense that, that the red really does catch your eye and it covers where she's being violated, but it also helps us see that she is being violated.
I just wanted to say about that too. It really looks like the action of the men is at the center, and the women are not, they don't have any power really over what's going on. And I think that was an important message that was being conveyed to people.
Yeah, like helpless to object. And I will say, I think one of I can't possibly choose a favorite chapter, but in Sacred Pleasure, Riane's sort of expose on Athenian democracy and what it was and what it wasn't is really worth reading. And if that's a place of interest, we can spend a little more time on that perhaps next week. I haven't really decided what we're covering next week, but definitely looking at her take on Athenian democracy and the real status of women in that situation is very worth reading. All right, we need 2 more readers. Pleasure and Pain from the next page.
I can read the Dominator model.
Please do.
The infliction or threat of pain is integral to systems maintenance. The pleasures of touch in both sexual and parent-child relations are associated with domination and submission, and thus also with pain, be it in the so-called carnal love of sex or in the submission to a loving deity. The infliction and or suffering of pain are sacralized.
Beautiful. One more for the partnership model.
I'll do that one. Partnership model. Human relations are held together more by pleasure bonds than by fear and pain. The pleasures of caring behaviors are socially supported, and pleasure is associated with empathy for others. Caretaking, lovemaking, and other activities that give pleasure are considered sacred.
Wonderful. So this comes back to the question of what do we associate in images with the experience of the divine? And I pulled up a few pleasant renditions of that. And I just made a little note here. The prominence of martyrdom in Christianity serves to sacralize pain and suffering. And then also that, so on the right here, we have the Transfiguration of Teresa of Avila, and she's a mystic from Spain in the 1500s, and she had a piercing vision of Christ, and the story goes that she saw and felt a burning arrow going into her heart. Now, of course, that's a really violent, horrifying image. Interestingly enough, the lore goes that she was one of the incorruptibles. There was a little bit of a territory war over which town would be where she was buried. And so she was actually exhumed 6 months after she died and was reburied. And when they exhumed her corpse, they found that she had not decayed. So she was set down amongst the Catholic incorruptibles, and then eventually parts of her body were taken as relics. Her heart was taken. You can actually see it in a cathedral in Spain. But the legend goes that you could actually see the mark of the burning arrow on her heart, that there was actually a perforation in her heart from this experience. So she was a famous, there's a great comment in the chat, in Christianity, love hurts. Absolutely. Yes, and more to be said about that for sure. But the mystics also teach us, I will say that, so the imagery of martyrdom is of course violent and horrific. And first and foremost, it serves to demonstrate to us that we need to be obedient to the religious and political systems, or else we will be punished. If we have a vision of God that does not adhere to the system in place, we will be martyred. That is the cost of having our own personal vision of God. The mystics also teach us that at the highest levels of transcendent consciousness, no amount of punishment can coerce us into denying holy truth or revelation. So I am personally very grateful that there is that dual meaning to these images.
I find it interesting, the whole chatter now about Christian nationalism and how we're beginning to exclude people, and how anybody who's claiming to be Christian isn't doing anything that's Christ-like. Mm-hmm. So I find that just fascinating, and the history behind it goes back to the 1950s. So it's not new, but again, it's a lot of those things that are hidden in plain sight that we just didn't know about. And now to hear about one more thing, it's like, you got to be kidding me.
Right. Well, and Riane's always quick to mention that, especially when we think about the repeal and reversal of Roe versus Wade and the loss of reproductive rights in this country, that has been a project 30 years in the making by Christian organizations. I mean, specifically when we think about Focus on the Family and other organizations from starting 30, 40 years ago, they know what's up. They know what changes the system. They specifically put an enormous amount of money into re-solidifying the image of the patriarchal dominator father and the nuclear family as the essence of American family life and good family virtue. And 30 years later, that has paid off, and so again, it really comes back to the way we shape our families and children's early life. Nowadays, more people believe that the father should be the head of the household than believed that 20, 30 years ago. So that's the return on investment. That is a very real return on investment, which was consciously made. And I will say the forces of partnership get a little bit more scattered when it comes to asserting our values in family life. And I think some of that has to do with the way that religious and virtue and moral language has been essentially co-opted and possessed by dominator religion, dominator Christianity specifically in this country. And so people who are progressives or people who want to support a transition to more partnership model orientation struggle finding words that they can own, like family values. Why don't we get to have family values? So it's been a long project, and it's borne a lot of fruit. And Christian nationalism, it's coming back, but it's certainly interestingly enough, there was Christian nationalism early on also had relationship to Nazism and other forms of horrific religious oppression. So, and in the United States, and it has deep roots here. So the one encouraging thing I find, though, in some of these images of the saints is that they're, I brought up 1984 and Brave New World last week. And of course, at the end of 1984, these two people have had this tremendous love affair. But at the very end, he's tortured with rats and he denies her. And it's sort of Orwell's take on, obviously Wilson wasn't quite a saint, but many of these other figures still remain true to what they had seen of God, even if they had to die for it, because they had a taste of eternity. And that exists for us too. Power and love, one more. I'll read the first one. Dominator model. The highest power is the power to dominate and destroy, symbolized since remote antiquity by the lethal power of the blade. Love and passion are frequently used to justify violent and abusive actions by those who dominate, as in the killing of women by men when they suspect them of sexual independence, or in holy wars said to be waged out of love for a deity that demands obeisance from all. I also wanted to mention love and care for the soul of the savage is also one of these justifications, right? The white man's burden and whatnot else. So you can, just or from a slightly more recent era, destroying the village to save it, right? It's that same kind of thinking. And who would like to read the last one?
Linda Demicat will, if that's all right.
Thank you, Linda. That's perfectly great.
Thank you. Partnership model. The highest power is the power to give, nurture, and illuminate life, symbolized since remote antiquity by the holy chalice or grail. Love is recognized as the highest expression of the evolution of life on our planet, as well as the universal unifying power.
Wonderful. And I thought, the chalice and the blade are such wonderfully vivid and concrete symbols. And I also thought to myself, goodness, they both feature highly in the Arthurian legend, which is also part of one of these big partnership resurgences in the Western canon. And so I just think it's really interesting that Arthur as a mythic figure begins with the blade, but then spends the rest of his time searching for the chalice. And I thought that was worth mentioning. Okay, so a large part of this text and of this work is going into looking at the ways all of our old stories that have been used to justify and reify and maintain dominator spirituality and dominator systems across the board, that they have clues, they have little hints and clues that there really was a time before, that it's not inevitable. This is not the way it's always been. For example, Riane likes to talk about how as a child, she never quite understood why a woman would take advice from a snake. What is that about? Why would a woman take a snake's life advice? That seems odd. But then, of course, she learned later on that that the snake, specifically the python, was a symbol of female deity and female connection with the divine. There were priestesses who worked with pythons as part of their trance induction and part of their ritual life. So the image of the woman with the snake was something that they had to pervert and turn into something evil in order to essentially undermine those older mythologies. One of the parallels I see, so as she discusses the ways in which imperial Roman Christianity worked to uproot some of the remnants of these old religions and these old belief systems, it reminds me very much of the re-education camps for Native Americans and for indigenous populations, both here and in Canada, that people were taken away from their family and their origins and essentially assimilated, or there was the attempt to assimilate them. They didn't get to learn their languages. They didn't get to learn their ritual culture. They were taken away from their society. And that is taking the children and reprogramming them is really the quickest way to destroy a society, genocide without murder. Essentially, of course, we know that there was violence and death and horror, but if you see what I mean, it almost looks clean on paper. And if you really believe that your society is the best and true society, and you really believe that your way of life is God's chosen way of life, and that otherwise these people are doomed to hell, you can justify to yourself any amount of cruelty to save the souls of those children, right? So similarly, tools like that have been used across the last several thousand years to uproot the small amounts of hints and clues that we have that there was a different way that we related to God and nature and each other. King Arthur and the Troubadours. And I also just kind of wanted to indulge for a moment in what I think is one of my favorite hints and clues, which is Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is actually the most popular, the most commonly produced of all of Shakespeare's plays. And it begins in a state of chaos. In fact, one could argue it begins in a state of intense climate change because the sacred marriage has been disrupted. The sacred marriage of the fairy queen and the fairy king is not being consummated. We enter into a world in which the seasons are topsy-turvy. The fields are rotting. The sheep are dying. The rivers are flooding. Snowstorms happen in the summer, and in the winter there are budding roses. And that's all happening because the sacred union is off. And we also are brought into Athenian society, in which men, fathers, have the right to bestow their daughters on whomsoever they please, even if the daughter isn't particularly interested in the union. And so, as often is the case in Shakespeare, in order to greet the divine chaos and in order to right the wrongs of civilization, you have to go to the woods. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about the opening to transcendence is also being an invitation to chaos, coming back to Riane's attention to chaos theory, that domination and partnership are the two primary attractors that we can move towards, or that we can move towards in moments of disequilibrium and chaos. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, we also know that Theseus has just conquered the Amazons. So there's the perversion of the sacred marriage. Oberon and Titania are not getting it on, and then Theseus has conquered the Amazons and is forcing their queen Hippolyta to marry him. So we have these patterns of perversion of the sacred marriage. And it takes two pairs of young people going into the woods and being messed with by fairies. And then also, of course, another perversion of the sacred marriage, Oberon tricking Titania into falling in love with an ass, to turn it all a little bit back to its right side. But of course, as Shakespeare always does, he doesn't leave it neat and tidy. The fact is that it was only Titania's deep humiliation that brought her back into union with Oberon. So again, even though Theseus and Hippolyta are treating each other more perhaps as equals in the end, that there is a new sense of love and union, and the two young people who are supposed to, the young people who are supposed to marry each other do. Jack shall have his Jill and all shall be well. Even so, there is still that seed of the domination resurgence, because the only reason that the fairy queen and king are back together is that she was deeply degraded and humiliated. Okay, we don't get to do small groups today, but with the time that we have left, I wanted to open up to a group conversation, if that seems to work. We talked a little bit in the chat about holy language. I also think that it's a potentially fruitful. These are all seeds for conversation, and I think we've all seen that once people start sharing their thoughts, we go lots of interesting places. So please use these as prompts, but not as dictates. And anytime anyone likes to get the conversation started, the floor is open.
Well, I'm thinking about your comment about the whole Garden of Eden story and how the snake has always gotten a bad rap. And in the shamanic tradition, there are 4 archetypes, and one of them is the serpent. And the serpent is one of the few animals that sheds its skin in order to grow. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And then you go through the jaguar, goes to the place where it has no predators for courage. The hummingbird, who, stops briefly its flapping of the wings in order to taste the sweet nectar. And then the eagle is the bird that flies highest over everything to get a perspective. And so just thinking about and sort of meditating on those 4 archetypes just opens up like a whole thing. And it doesn't, it doesn't take away from anything I've learned in many traditions. In fact, sort of the cafeteria approach to faith is like, what are the things that feed me, as opposed to the things that suck the life out of me like a freaking vampire. I've discarded those. I've shed that skin so that I can grow.
Absolutely, and definitely throughout this book, we're also looking at that pattern that you're talking about, the snake's shedding its skin, death, rebirth, regeneration as a fundamentally. Well, when we get into this idea of masculine versus feminine qualities of the Godhead, it gets a little silly. In fact, I just saw an old interview from Riane that only recently got put up on the internet, in which she also asserts that we need to go beyond this idea that there are certain things that are essentially masculine and certain things that are essentially feminine, that there are human things. And she said, when I assert my my caring and when I enact my ability to care and nurture, I'm not enacting my feminine. I'm enacting myself. And likewise, when I'm being assertive or opinionated or insightful or rational, I'm not enacting my masculine. I'm enacting myself. And that essentially these are human qualities, encoding them in these ways, and then creating hierarchies of what is higher and what is lower is all part of the dominator system that we want to move beyond. So the snake's ability to shed its skin, again, we're talking about that primordial chaos, right? That in our ability to greet the unknown and to shed who we've been before, that is where we meet ourselves, and that is where we enter the wilderness often enough. But it is also where there is that possibility for rebirth. And if the snake is unable to shed its skin, it dies. It smothers itself. See something in the chat that looks pretty meaty. All right. So I'm just going to read this one out loud. As I mentioned earlier, I have a good relationship with holy language, but I have changed where I worship to join forces with a church that is more egalitarian, and where the first thing they say is, no matter who you are or where you are on your life's journey, you are welcome here. That to me is the sacred at its best. There's a strong sense of unity with others, along with an alliance with the divine. I feel happy to have found them to help me in my relationship with the divine. Also, the pastors are a woman and a man, a wife and a husband who co-lead the services. Oh, that sounds wonderful. I'm really glad you found that. And yeah, sometimes, and again, that's another death and rebirth, right? You had to leave behind your prior community of worship and find something that really nourished your soul on a different level. Beautiful.
I work with rape survivors, and the rape survivors that I work with, it seems that most of them have had childhood abuse. One of the things that Kolk points out, but anybody who's worked with people that have lived this, or maybe we found it in ourselves if we've been subjected to this, is that curiosity is really quashed. And one way I sit with people is looking for awe, is saying what was awesome. And I asked them to put together an awesome diary, like a bullet point, to touch in on that non-rational part, as the Dominator will say. I've already fought against that one. It's not rational. It's got its own rationality, but the part that they can't consciously understand what it's saying or doing, and lead in maybe with something big, but then mention how something small. And that, I think, is a transcendence that we get to watch. So I can study, I can fully understand that this mountain is awesome, and that awe, and then how to also find awe in that small thing, like the hummingbird. My daughter is now completely tripped out about hummingbirds because she saw them and she saw what they do, and there was a lake and things like that. So to even go that pathway allows change to happen and shift. And I believe in the transcendence and the collective power, like we did with the hands. I really do believe that this energy's gone there and somewhere else as well. I don't even think it's a zero sum. But I find awe is the entry point that I can non-religiously, because a lot of these people have been offended by a religion, and it's a scary place to even go near. One reason they've run away from it. And awe is really one of the ones. So I don't even do the gratitude. I think I need to do awe often first.
It's interesting that you brought up gratitude right at the end. I mean, there's so much to dig in there, but I also mentioned that lower in the slide, I'm bringing up the idea that certain ideas of virtue may also be part of an internalization of a domination structure. I see a lot of people in the sort of recovering from the New Age community talking a lot about gratitude practice and gratitude culture, and how sometimes it's actually used to shame people who are struggling, and to tell people that the real virtue is being grateful in what you have and not complaining, sort of stay sweet mentality, right? And so that's another place where religion and spirituality can really, even something that we think of as essentially benign, a gratitude practice, or that has been studied as helpful in terms of mental health, can also be used to dominate people and to shame them.
And one way I step in with that, because yes, I hear that very, very, very much. And also, what do I have to be grateful for? Which we hear on the other side, on the Dominator model, when the white people say, I'm out of work. What do you mean, that we've got privilege? And they say, so they might get simple and say, well, okay, I'm happy to have a house and a roof over my head. I have created a visualization of gratitude towards your body with a body visit. So I've taken away the body scan, which never liked that at all. They said, no, we're going to visit. What do? You knock on the door, you step back, you wait till you're invited in, and you have a compliment when you go to somebody's house. Even if nothing's changed, you invent, you imagine. And they go and visit. I ask them to visit. And I say, where's your front door? Where would you like to enter in? And thanking their body for being there for them. And did you know that the ankle is another heart? It pumps the blood. No, I didn't. Did you know that the veins have valves and they don't let the blood settle down? No, I didn't. And I think there's a transcendence as well. So out of the pain and out of the now and the me and the consciousness, and then going back into the body. Mine might be very visceral or just maybe low grade, but I'm finding that offers a way of healing that is not clinically psychotherapy or analysis or anything like this. I used to have to be quiet about these things that I used to do, but now with COVID and Colk and things like that, the somatic practices are now to the fore. But I'm finding, and then they find going into their body awesome.
Wonderful. And just to, again, a minor note of indulgence on that point of awe, right? And finding awe in small things. I brought up Teresa of Avila before. She's kind of one of my very favorite presences to call into my life. And in her, I would say her masterwork, The Interior Castle, she talks about the silkworm at length. She has a very long, rapturous discussion of the silkworm and how incredible it is. And so it is, the ability to see, the ability to really explore the experience of awe and welcome the experience of awe. I think is, and certainly the existentialists talk about this a lot, that even if you don't believe in a God, the craving for awe is a fundamental human experience, and that the need for awe to not only feel that there is so much wonder around, but also that we are part of that wonder, and that we exist in relationship with that wonder. It may or may not be something that you think of as a religious or spiritual experience, but it is profoundly human, and it's something that we crave. It is medicine. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit because there is a little bit more that I wanted to introduce, and we still have a few more minutes. And also, Kimball, I want to thank you for bringing up the word transcendent so much, because now we're going to talk about trance and its potential to both harm and help. So, of course, in religious rites and religious rituals, trance induction is a big part of it. Frankly, in psychotherapeutic practices, trance induction is a big part of it. In going to live music, trance induction is part of the pleasure that we seek. In partner dancing and all these wonderful group rituals that human beings have been doing on and on and on in various ways for a very, very long time. So much of it is about cultivating states of trance. And those states of trance can be used to create group cohesion. And that group cohesion can serve either side of this polarity. They can serve rituals of exile and sacrifice, and they can serve rituals of potluck and nurturance. So I also wanted to bring up that, again, revisiting this idea of chaos, that allowing yourself into a trance state and intentionally inducing light states of trance create the ground for wider and sometimes deeper psychological change. And again, that can be used and it can be misused. Trance can easily be weaponized. I don't know if any of you have ever watched the Nuremberg rallies, but Hitler was a master of trance induction. He was an absolute master of it. And I don't say that as praise, but I do say it with awe. I experience awe when I watch those things, and it's not fun. But he used trance to bring people into a shared state of consciousness, and it was incredibly effective. So trance states can be used to liberate and come into union, positive union, helpful union, bringing in these partnership virtues and bringing in the joy of caring. It can be used to help people who are recovering from trauma. It also can trigger them. So of course, if you're working with people clinically who are trauma survivors, you have to be very careful and know how to pull them out of those states. Obviously, the experiments now are coming back with psychedelics, and unfortunately, a lot of harm has already been done in some of those studies because the trance state and its potential for chaos is not, I think, fully understood or respected. Robert J. Lifton, he's another one of my favorite thinkers that I come back to over and over. He was one of the early theorists around thought reform, or what we might call brainwashing or mind control. And eventually he became an expert in cults and extremist groups. He and Margaret Singer talk about the process of creating a cult personality. And essentially, I mean, it boils down to a 3-stage process, which is that you take a person out of their ordinary life, out of the ordinary context for their persona, you put them in a completely different context, you destabilize the personality they have, and then you introduce the desires of the group. You create social reinforcement for a different kind of personality, and then you use that reinforcement to essentially freeze that new personality as that person's new sense of self. And techniques like love bombing are also used not only to draw people in, but to give them a sense that that new self will be more loved than their old self was. And trance states feature highly in methods of thought reform. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and many of these practices, again, can be used to harm or to help. So trance is necessary. It can be medicinal. It can be healing. It can also just be darn fun, and it can also be highly weaponized. And so people wonder how some of the things in our country can happen, and this is how it happens. Trance induction is how it happens. I mean, I've watched more Trump rallies than I like to acknowledge, or at least I've watched significant portions of them. And he is also very, very good at some of the techniques of trance induction, the call and response that he does with his audience. The whole sense of ritual and group identification, it is profound. It is very profound. And those people are having a really positive experience and feeling a sense of community and engagement, and their self as they experience it is being very much encouraged and also solidified after those processes. And so this comes back to some identity theory stuff. The traditional identity theory is a model of, in terms of human development across the lifespan, it's essentially a model of increasing levels of skill and individuation. That's the Ericksonian model. I sometimes also call it the self as tank model, because eventually the idea is that you're so developed and you're so mature that you can go into any situation and essentially stay the same. The feminists came along in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and critiqued that, suggesting it really didn't reflect women's experiences of self-identity and maturation. They proposed a self and relationship model. And Robert J. Lifton suggests a protean model of the self. Proteus is the shape-shifting god, right? And so between all of these theories, we can kind of come to a deeper understanding of all of the ways in which we can change and develop, that we are people who exist in relationship, and relationships do define us. We also do exist as individuals with individual memory, and the more we change situations, the more we might want to hang on to that individual memory as a source of self and identity, because changing social circumstances, it can be really chaotic and really confusing for people. And then we have Lifton's idea that the protean self is sort of the answer to internalized domination and authoritarianism, the ability to shapeshift, the ability to be your many selves and to welcome and develop and understand and accept your many selves, rather than essentially what he calls the totalitarian psyche idea that there's just one. It's sort of the monotheistic idea of the self, that there's just one, and it should develop and stay the same and enact all these virtues and, you know, be the same person at work and at home and all of that. That is essentially the cult identity model, right? And it leads to a lot of fragmentation and a lot of disconnection and unhappiness. So, but taking those three identity models together, we can sort of understand that this is it's sort of like the dual nature of light. We are all of these things. So also just worth mentioning that group processes enhance and strengthen trance inductions. So I actually received a really wonderful reflection from someone today, and it mentioned that it was easier to pursue certain pleasures alone, and then doing things in a group that otherwise would give that kind of that light trance induction. I think it was music creation, that it might give a sense of satisfaction, but instead it was a producer of anxiety. Group processes and altered states of consciousness, unless you really, really feel safe and secure in the group, can be an agent of creating social anxiety and disconnection and alienation. And I think certainly after 2 years of pandemic life, a lot of people feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more safe exploring mild trance states and personal pleasures alone. And so there's, I think, an enormous need now to find safe places of community, safe places for ritual, light transcenduction, and spiritual experience in groups, but also to be wary that all of those processes can be weaponized, and no sinister group is going to tell you who they are in the beginning. So it's a bit of a catch-22 if we want to find ritual community. And we're already alienated. There's a bit of a catch-22 because we have to let down our guard and engage in the trance in order to actually have the experience. But we also have to be very wary that these processes can be weaponized and people lie and manipulate and use those processes against us. Okay, and also, yeah, I just wanted to mention that I also heard several people reflecting on feeling guilt for pursuing personal pleasures, feeling guilty or anxious, and that there was a sense that that they should be busy doing something else. Okay, so homework for next week, always optional, but I wanted to suggest that you on your own just explore something that's going to give you maybe a mild trance state, maybe even an invitation into awe, silent meditation, walks in nature, dancing, drumming, singing. If you have a safe person, explore it with them. It doesn't have to be alone, but it absolutely can. And journal a little bit about it or share it with a friend. Essentially, this exercise is just deepening what we did last week together and what was sort of the homework for the first week. Deepening that conscious and intentional experience of pleasure, and also opening up a little bit to the chaos, because in a mild trance state, you're not necessarily going to be controlling what you experience. You might have a sudden burst of emotion. It might even be uncomfortable. So if this is interesting to you, go ahead and practice it safely, practice it with support if you feel like you might need that, or if you're in a fragile state, maybe don't, maybe wait. Okay. And I also just wanted to mention, there's a couple more comments in the chat. If you need to go right now, I totally understand. We are a few minutes over, so I apologize for that. Thank you all for being here. Yes, okay, toxic positivity. US is in a fear, collective trauma trance state. Yes, people are easily manipulated. And of course, COVID has exacerbated that because we are all isolated. We don't get the same sort of social reinforcement that we get for the ordinary ways of being a good person in society. And the internet is a hotbed of paranoia and fear and distrust. So yeah, we have a lot of repairing work to do. I just recently visited an evangelical church where I saw a strong trance induction happening with the music. It was powerful. There was a forceful sermon that followed, and I saw where the method was incredibly effective. Yeah, church, like a good church does this, and people get hooked on it. People like going and getting their trance. Okay, thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And if you have something to share, please reach out.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful week. See you next week, or maybe Tuesday for the 1619 project.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Ponder. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.